you. Is this good? This works. Recently I gave a lecture and it didn't really go well. The students didn't laugh at my jokes. One was even sleeping. So I thought, well, obviously there must be something wrong with the microphone. So I asked, so can people hear me in the back? And actually there's one guy in the back row that said, no, I can't hear you. But then there was one guy at the first row that said, I'd like to change seats then. Anyway, thank you very much for the words of introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. Apart from the experiences that you describe, I've also written a few books on these topics. One is 300 pages long, my master work. I was really proud, and I thought, okay, this is going to change the debate on climate change and environment in Denmark. It didn't. It's been out for a few years, and I think it sold 700 copies. And I'm pretty sure my mother bought quite a few of them. But I also wrote another book, which is just a small book about humor and politics, humorous quotations and jokes. That was sold out in 2 days. So that taught me all the boring stuff. Forget about it. People don't want it. Stick to the jokes. I'm not going to do that today, but I'm going to start with one anecdote, though, about that's probably pretty typical to the discussion that we're facing on climate change. Some years ago, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Miss Margaret Thatcher, whom I'm sure you all know, visited the European Parliament. And she was asked a question by one of my colleagues, Mr. Michel Rocard from France, who said, Miss Thatcher, when do you think Great Britain will be ready to abandon the British pound and become a member of the euro? To which she answered, not in a million years. Mr. Rocard replied, I interpret your answer in the way that we agree on the goal but disagree on the timing. Now, we haven't got 1 million years to wait for action on climate change. Sometimes you might think we have when you listen to some of the people that discuss these topics. But the fact of the matter is that the science is now so overwhelming. The scientific proofs are now so overwhelming that nobody can really doubt any longer that this is a very real problem. You cannot discuss whether or not the greenhouse effect exists. If the greenhouse effect did not exist, we would have minus 17 degrees Celsius on the Earth. The greenhouse effect is a part of the natural biological system of the Earth that controls the climate. And therefore, the greenhouse effect as such is not a problem. The problem is that we've increased the level of CO2 in our atmosphere so that it heats us up too much. So, whenever people tell you, well, we've always had variations in the climate, obviously, they're telling the truth. But what they miss in that argument is that we've never had a situation that can compare to the one we have now, in which human activity has influenced the climate in a way that we can measure it. People might also argue that, well, we will have an ice age at one stage. Well, we will. People can also argue, well, maybe it's actually the way the sun moves vis-a-vis the planet Earth that influences the temperature. It does. A lot of things influence the temperature. But for a politician, and I think for any citizen, what's really relevant to discuss is how much do we influence the temperature and what can we do? Now, if you look back 10,000 years, the time in which we've had what we call a civilization. 10,000 years. In average, the temperature hasn't increased or decreased more than 1 degree. So some years it's been hotter, some years it's been colder, some places in the world it's been hotter, some places it's been colder. But in average, not more than 1 degree below or above the average temperature. So this is really the range of temperature in which we know how the different biosystems work, in which we know which effects this has on the level of the seas and other different things. But what we're seeing now is an increase in temperature that's going above 1 degree. Already now, scientists say that the global heating, the global warming, has led to an average increase on just below 1 degree. Just below 1 degree. So we're just below what we know. We're just inside the range that we know, where we know the effects. But if we don't change our behavior and the way we use fossil fuels, then within the end of this century, scientists are now warning us we might have an increase in temperature on 6 degrees. Now, these are obviously some of the more negative scenarios. There are also more positive ones. But, 6 degrees is now a plausible scenario. Just 4 years ago, that was not considered plausible. Now that's very plausible. And even the most optimistic scientists say, well, if we don't do anything, then maybe 3 degrees or 4 degrees. Now, I went to Greenland recently. On the west coast, there's a small town called Ilulissat. Just north of that is a glacier called Ikisamia. That glacier moves. It's connected to the inland ice, and it moves ice into the sea. This has been going on for 10,000s of years. What's happening now, because of the quite small increase in temperature that we see already, is that it's moving at an enormous speed, 2 meters per hour. This means that you can actually see it with your eyes, that it's moving. And you can hear it because when massive chunks of ice, 50 meters times 50 meters, break off and fall into the ocean, it's almost like a thunder. The melting water from this one glacier, and this is just one out of many glaciers, from this one glacier is equal, per day, is equal to the entire water consumption of a city like New York in a year. Per day from one glacier. Now, the oceans of the world are huge, so you can't really see it yet, but it gives you a sense of what it is we're talking about. If the temperature increases to 6 degrees, the poles will start melting, the ice cap of Greenland, inland ice, will melt. Not entirely, but a lot of it will melt. And the increase of the seas in the world will probably be between 5 and 7 meters. Now, if that happens, it's easy for everybody to understand the consequences. Even in Europe, the investments that we need to do to deal with this problem are enormous. Sir Nicholas Stern, whom you've probably heard about, who wrote the report called the Stern Review. He used to work for the World Bank and was asked by the British government to calculate, okay, how much do we expect we have to invest in order to prevent this problem, and then compare that to how much do we have to spend if we don't prevent but just choose to adapt. And he said, well, in order to prevent this problem, we need to invest probably around 0.5% of our GDP every year in the richest countries of the world. And since we normally have a growth rate of about 1.5%, this does not mean we have to have a lower standard of living. It just means that we have to get even richer at a little bit slower rate. Now, if we don't do anything, we might end up in a situation where we have to spend about 20% of our GDP, about 1/5 of all the means we've got. treating the symptoms of this, dealing with the problems, adapting. Obviously, you can always discuss these numbers. I'm sure Timo has some arguments against the way it's been calculated. But fact of the matter is, it's going to be extremely difficult and expensive to adapt, even if you don't look at the more moral parts of the question. If you do choose to look of this as a moral question, then really you have to know that in a country like Bangladesh, the water doesn't have to raise its levels by 5 or 7 meters for it to be a problem. It just has to raise by 50 centimeters, half a meter. And then it becomes a problem for millions and millions of people in a country like Bangladesh. In another country like Peru, I read somewhere that between 60 and 70% of the population depends on water from one glacier. If that glacier melts, what are they to do? In Sudan, not in 20 years or 30 years, but today in Sudan, we have probably one of the worst situations in the world. We have a conflict that, if you look at it, obviously is connected to some political and ethnic conflicts. But if you look at what it really is that they're fighting about, why it is that they're killing each other, it's politics that decide who are killing who, but why are they killing each other? It's because they fight about access to clean water, access to fertile land, access to land where what's the name? The cows and can grass. So really, this is something. These three things are something that are really affected by climate change. Even now in a situation where the temperature has only increased with 1 degree. This has led to migration of around more than 1 million people just from Sudan. 200,000 people have been killed, between 150,000 and 200,000. This is just one country, and this is now even before we see the real problems connected to climate change. So for me, really, discussing whether or not to do something is not relevant. Nevertheless, even in a country like Denmark, where we started with you probably heard Mr. Peterson yesterday tell you how we started already in the 70s discussing these things and have done quite a lot. Even in Denmark, we still discuss, is this even a problem? Well, let me put it this way. If you're not convinced by looking at what's actually going on in different places in the world, then ask yourself this question. We have the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, United Nations. They said in their last report, which is already too old, but they said in their last report that they can conclude now with 90% certainty that global warming is happening and that it's the human influence is to blame. I think most of these people would say now that it's not 90%, but probably 98% or 99%. But let's say it's just 90%. If you have, as a person, symptoms that you're sick, and you visit 10 doctors, and 9 of them tell you this is extremely serious, you might die. But the good news is I have the medicine. Will you take the medicine, or will you listen to the doctor number 10 that you might visit that tell you, I'm not really sure that it's 90%. I think it's maybe probably only 50-50 that you'll die. Okay, so if number 10 tells me it's only 50-50, then clearly I'm not going to take the medicine. Of course you are. Of course you are. If you look at it in that way, then really there's no reason not to act. In the EU, we've done, I think, quite a lot. We've adapted legislation on this as the first region in the world. We call our climate package the 2020 plan. In the year 2020, we need to have reduced our CO2 emissions by 20% compared to 1990s levels, and 20% of all our energy needs to come out of renewable sources. Also, these are not binding targets though, the first two are, but we also have targets for energy efficiency, which are also 20% in 2020. Then it needs to be 20% more effective than we are today. We even have decided that if other countries become a part of a global agreement with comparable measures, we will automatically increase the 20% reduction targets to 30%. If somebody had told me 5 years ago that we would be able to do legislation like that, binding legislation like that in Europe, 5 years ago I just started in the European Parliament. I just had my first meeting in the Environment Committee. I just discussed with my German colleagues, now that we're in Germany, even Social Democrats, which have the same opinion as me, are very influenced, of course, by the huge industry in this country, by the labor unions, and these are my friends. On the other side, we have the right wing of the parliament arguing from a total different perspective. So, 5 years ago, had you asked me, could this be done, I would have said never, ever. But the politics changed. In just 2 or 3 years, it changed. And in 1 year, it only took us 1 year. To those of you who know how long these processes normally are, it only took us 1 year to make the legislation that are now the most ambitious in the world. So for me, this is a sign that even though, if you read the textbooks, a global solution is not possible, well, 5 years ago, nobody thought it was possible on a European level. So maybe we can use that as an example, and maybe we can hope that the leadership from the EU will lead to also a global solution. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we need to acknowledge that not only are the consequences global, the reasons for the problem are also global. Historically, they're not really. Because if you look at it historically, it's the EU countries, European countries, and the United States that has polluted by far the most. So really, it's our responsibility. But if you look at it in a different way, which you need when you need to solve the problem, you also have to acknowledge that now the situation has changed. Also, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, developing countries need to be a part of the solution. The biggest emitters, polluters in the world right now are China, the US, and the EU. China are responsible for 20-something% of the CO2 emissions, around 25%, some say. The US just below that, and the EU between 15 and 17%. Now, obviously, there's a big difference because there's 317 million people in the US. They pollute almost as much as China, which is also 317 plus a billion people. So per capita, obviously, the US are by far the biggest polluter. European Union has around just below 500 million people. We need these three players to be a part of a global solution. The way that we've gone forward with that is to do it, try to do it at least in the United Nations framework. The meetings that has been taking place every year for 15 years now, the COP meetings, a lot of people thought that the COP15 had something to do with the fact that it was held in Copenhagen, that COP was short for Copenhagen. That's not the fact. COP is short for Conference of Parties. Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC. You really need to get good at these. UNFCCC is United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. And the 15th meeting was in Copenhagen this December. I've participated in the last 3 meetings, the one in Bali, the one in Poznan, and the one in Copenhagen. And I'll say a little bit more about why we had a failure in Copenhagen, but before I get to that, I'll just explain a little bit what the whole goal of this process is. We have now stated, this is actually something that the EU did as the first region in the world, that our target is to not allow increases in temperature to exceed 2 degrees. So we don't even have as a goal that we will prevent climate change and increase in temperature. That's already too late. So even if we reach our target, which in a minute you'll see why it's not very likely, but even if we reach it, we will still actually have climate change that will have quite serious effects. So even though 2 degrees are considered extremely ambitious, really, you could also very well argue that even that's not enough. Okay, so why is it that we've chosen the 2 degrees? This is now also the official aim of the COP process. This is now also something that China and the US have signed up to. And this is because the science tells us that if we exceed the 2 degrees, then we will be in a situation where we can no longer control the process. After 2 degrees, we have a lot of self-enhancing mechanisms. Let me mention just a few of them. One is the permafrost in Siberia and other places in the world. You have huge areas of land that has permanent frost. In this frost in the ground you have a lot of methane gas. Now if the temperature increases and there's no longer frost, then the gas will be emitted into the atmosphere, thus increasing the temperature even more, thus emitting even more methane gas. That's just one of the vicious circles. Another one is when ice melts, the poles or the Greenland ice cap. Normally what happens when the radiation from the sun hits the ice is it's just reflected back into the atmosphere without causing any global heating. What happens if there's no ice and it hits water or ground instead? It's transformed into another frequency. And if that happens, then it's absorbed by the greenhouse gases, primarily CO2. So the more ice that melts, the more global heating, the more ice will melt. All of these effects and all of these vicious circles, most scientists agree, happens after 2 degrees. I'm going to say something now that will make you in a really, really bad mood, because actually this is just something we tell ourselves so that we have, so that we can have just still some hope. But the fact of the matter is, probably, if you ask me, that it's not 2 degrees, it's probably 1.5 degrees. But we will never reach that, so we have to go for the 2 degrees. How do we stay below 2 degrees? Well, science tells us that 2 degrees is probably something that will occur when we have 450 ppm. 450 ppm is 450 parts per million, 450 CO2 particles per million particles in the atmosphere. To stay below that, we need to reduce our emissions in the richest countries of the world by between 25 and 40% compared to 1990s level in 2020. Between 25 and 40% in the richest countries of the world. And in 2050, we need to have reduced by between 80 and 90%. These are the developed countries. Does not include China. China, everybody acknowledges that this is a country in growth. This is a country that you cannot tell them to stop their economic growth. They still have 500 million people living under the poverty level. Apart from that, the reason that they have an increase in emissions is because they're producing goods for us. So instead of talking about them having to decrease emissions, we talk about a year in which they have to have a peak in their emissions. That year needs to be between 2015 and 2020. Let me just say a few words more about the situation in China. I'm going to give you some examples of what's going on in China right now, and you're going to think, no. But really, these are official numbers from the European Commission, and they are usually a pretty valid source on these topics. Every day, no, let me start elsewhere. China has a growth rate of between 8 and 10% GDP every year. Even now, with the economic crisis, financial crisis, they still have a growth rate of between 6 and 8%. This means that you see astonishing trends. Every day, not every year or every month, but every day, 10,000 new cars hit the street. Not in all of China, just in Beijing. 10,000 new cars in one city every day. Every hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. A new skyscraper is finished, has been completed. A new skyscraper. Every hour. So, every 2 or 3 days, a new power plant, coal power plant, is opened. So, you see, if we don't find a way of also including China in this process, and if we don't find a way for them to become more energy efficient and transform that growth into a more sustainable growth, then it's almost impossible for us to imagine that they will peak in 2015 or 2020. Now, what has been attempted to do in the COP process, and what many of us actually thought was a feasible outcome of Copenhagen, but it didn't quite turn out that way, was a binding, if not legally binding yet, then at least a politically binding agreement stating, first of all, that it's the 2 degrees target. This is actually one thing that we did get. But second, also committed the developed countries to mitigation, that is binding reduction targets in the 25 to 40 level at the short term and the 80 to 90 level in the long term. And the developing countries, primarily China, South Africa, Brazil, India, so-called basic countries, to peak their emissions, as I said, between 15 and 20. This didn't happen. The Copenhagen Accord, which is by no means binding, even though it's not binding, they didn't manage to have these targets in there. All countries were asked to submit their reduction targets before 31st of January. Many countries have done. But all in all, it only adds up to reductions of 16%. So this is probably just about half of what we need if we believe the 2 degrees. And it's probably 1.5. So we're pretty far from the target. Developing countries, the only thing the text says is they need to peak as soon as possible. As soon as possible. Now, this is only one part of the equation, though. The other very important part of the equation, you have mitigation, but you also have financing. These are the 2 most important things that are negotiated. You have to remember that this is taking place for 15 years now. The last 2 years, it's been very concrete, very detailed negotiations on hundreds and hundreds of issues. The way these negotiations works is that there's a text in the center of all the negotiations. That text is around 200 pages. But then you have hundreds of other texts that need to feed into this text. And the way they feed in is that they become brackets, squared brackets. And then the negotiators, they have to get rid of these square brackets. Before Copenhagen, there was around 200 square brackets left. Today, there's almost none left. So the world has agreed on many things that you would never expect them to agree on. Problem is, the brackets that are still there are the ones that are the most important. They are the ones on mitigation and the second main problem, financing. Financing has primarily to do with adaptation. Because even if we stay below the 2 degrees, you'll still have climate change and you'll still have quite serious effects. So we need some way for the richest countries in the world to help the poorest countries of the world adapt. Now, one of the few positive things that came out of Copenhagen was short-term financing obligations. Actually, we decided to give, from 2010 to 2012, $30 billion US dollars. This will be new money. This won't be money that's just been transferred from developing aid. This is new money to adaptation. And we also agreed that in 2020, the developed countries need to give $100 billion every year. Problem is, we know who's going to pay for the short term, but we don't know who's going to pay for the long term yet. We know that these are the amount that we're looking for, but we don't know how much the EU is going to pay, how much is EU going to pay, how much is going to be taken out of the revenue for emission trading systems, things like that. And the reason we didn't get an agreement was because the richest countries did not want to give themselves obligations on the financing on the long term. They did not want to commit to targets that were in any way ambitious enough on the mitigation. These are the things that we can blame the US, to some extent also the EU, Japan and others. Then we have the developing countries, who I think you can also blame, especially China, for different things. What China did not want to do was commit to something called MRV. Means that whatever you do needs to be measurable, reportable, and verifiable. So China said, we will increase our energy intensity by 45% before 2020, and that's just another way of looking at it, but that would probably mean that they would peak in around that year. So that was actually pretty good. The problem was, they said, but you have to trust us on this one. We're not going to let you. We're not going to let you have any look into how we do it. Now, this obviously will never work. You need an international monitoring system. You need legal obligations to do these things. Another thing that I'll just mention from Copenhagen that was actually a success was something we call RED. RED is short for Reduction of Emissions from Forest Degradation and Deforestation. 20% of all emissions in the world today are from deforestation. 20%. This also has a lot of other negative effects on biodiversity and things like that. So there's many reasons for us to do something about that. Here, we did actually get an agreement that specifies what needs to be done and that also set in to place some mechanisms that makes it possible for the richest countries of the world to pay the poorest countries of the world not to chop down their trees. This is a positive thing. Okay, I'm getting closer to my conclusion, so that we will also have some time for questions. There's no doubt that Copenhagen was a failure. We had more than 100 heads of state coming to Denmark to get an agreement. We did not get one. I find it very difficult to see what will change before Mexico. We will not get the same momentum. We will not get the same amounts of important leaders to go there. We will not probably get more obligations put on the U.S. that they will accept, because we have an election, midterm election in the U.S. in November. So really, if anything, it might go in the wrong direction in the U.S. No signs that China will move either. So really, I'm quite a pessimist. On the other hand, we've managed to agree on so many things. Really, what we need now is just the political will of these players. I'm going to be fighting in the European Parliament for a more progressive line of the European Union. I don't know if we can change anything, but I think as long as we have just a small chance of getting an agreement in Mexico, we need to go for that. And one of the ways we can do that is to put on ourselves even more obligations. If we do that, then we're the leaders, and then at least the other actors will have to answer why they won't follow. So as I said, political will is all we need now, and as Al Gore always finishes his speeches, I'll do the same by saying political will is a renewable resource. Thank you.